Hi everyone, and thanks for coming to this presentation. So, how are you today? Yeah, hope you have a nice day and learn a lot of things through the different talks. So, today I'm going to speak about Angular 14 and more specifically about this feature of this version and their impact on our architecture and application. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Nicolas Frizzarin. I'm a developer advocate and engineering manager at Sphere. I come from Metz in France, and I'm also an OpenJS Foundation member and a Google developer expert in web technologies. So in few words, I love contributing in Node.js ecosystem and web ecosystem, or love to sharing my knowledge and experience with speaking at conference like today or writing articles and giving training. And before starting, I would like to say a few words about my company. Sphere is a consulting company based in France, Luxembourg, and in Belgium, so here. So don't hesitate to apply if you want, because currently we are hiring. So what will we see today? As I said, I am going to show you the features that bring Angular 14. And as you can imagine, I am going to show you one of the biggest features of this version, standalone components. Okay? The fact of having introduced standalone components have significantly impacted the routing. And that's why I will show you how routing is impacted. And in addition of this amazing feature, Angular introduced a new development pattern called the composition that we can already find in Vue 3 thanks to the composition API. We will deep dive in type form because now forms are typed. And finally, we will focus on quick tips and the next feature of Angular. So, standalone components is a way to say goodbye to ng modules, but in fact, standalone components is a new way to write components. And these components aim to simplify the way of writing components and ng modules, and they also aim to make ng modules optional. So Paweł Kozłowski, who is an Angular team member, writes in the Standalone Components RFC, given the central role of ng modules in Angular, it's hard to reason about components, directives, and pipes, and this is totally true because currently the whole ecosystem evolves around this notion. So application and library evolves around this notion. So currently, an application without ng modules can't even start. So before Angular 14, an Angular application is built around 4 important modules, and the first one is the root module. This is the most important module in your application because it's on this module that Angular will bootstrap. Okay, and that's why this root module contains your first component to display and generally providers that often used in your application. Second module is the core module. This core module contains your core application, and that's why it will contain providers that are common to the whole application. It will contain guards, interceptor, and components that are part of the application body, like footer, navbar, or header. Another important module is a feature module. But it's very important because this module is a functionalities of your application. Okay, so mainly it's a view of your application. And for more optimization, feature modules are lazy loaded. Okay, and because the lazy loading is done by modules, you must create a navigation module for each feature module to navigate to the correct component for a given path. And last module is the shared module. The shared module will become your biggest module of your application because the shared module will contain all the things that are shareable in the whole application. And that's why this module will contain the common, the often used module like commands module or reactive forms module. It will contain also shareable and customizable components, pipe, directives, and of course it will contain your components that are exposed by your design system, like ng0 or Angular material or ng Bootstrap or your made home design system. Okay, so wow, a lot of modules and files just to display a to-do list, for example, or a Hello World application. So the fact of having given a central role of ng modules have several impacts on the developer experience. And the first impact is on the beginners. When beginners want to try Angular technologies or write a simple Hello World application, they must understand the whole logic around the ng modules. They must understand what is imported, what is exported, what are the declaration and providers array. So a lot of logic just to display an Hello World. Second impact is on the components itself, because reading a component is not enough on its own. All the dependencies are not on the same file of the components, so you must read the ng module that imports the components to understand the whole business logic. Third impact is on the bootstrapping. Bootstrapping is too complex. Okay, and it's true because 4 files just to bootstrap your application. So index.html file, the app module file, the app component file, and the main.ts file. And sometimes we can say 5 files because without the angular.json file, we can't bootstrap your application. You can't build your application because this file is the identity card of your project. So bootstrapping is very too complex and easy to misuse. And the last impact is on the bundle size of your feature module. Okay, because the shared module will be imported in each feature module. And because your shared module will grow very quickly, your feature module will grow quickly too, for sometimes nothing. So it's important to understand that before Angular 14, Angular was the only web framework that the components, directive, and pipes are not unit reuse. Okay, in Vue, you can take your components and display it. In React, you can do exactly the same. But in Angular, you must create the modules and import the components in the modules just to use these components. So to solve these problems, Lars Brink Nilsson, who is MVP and contribute a lot for the Angular community, create a new pattern design called single components or single directive or single pipe as module. And the goal of this pattern is to place the components and the module in the same files. Okay? So all the problems that we have seen in the previous slide are solved. Okay, because it reduces files number, but we will have many or much modules, okay, because one component will be associated to one module. So if you create 2 components, you must create 2 modules. It will reduce the bundles of the components and the modules, okay, because the modules associated to the components must import only what the components needs to work properly. Okay, just that. And finally, the logic of unit reuse is unblocked. So based on this pattern, Standalone Components was born and welcome in the future of Angular. So to create standalone components is very, very easy because you have a new property available on the metadata of the component annotation, and this property is standalone. So if you set this property to true, you create a standalone component. But if you set this property to false, you create a classic component as you could do it before. By default, this property is false. So to create standalone components is very simple. Just add a new property in the metadata component annotation. But in fact, when you create a standalone component, you create a particular ng modules. Okay, this ng modules is called a virtual modules. Why it's a virtual module? Because this module is created when the application build, okay, and this module declare the associated components and export it. Okay, and like any other module, this module must import what the components need to work properly. And that's why you have a new property in the metadata of the component annotation called imports. This property is only available if you set the property standalone to true. Okay, and this property takes as a value an array of ng modules, an array of standalone components, or an array of a mix of both. So this is very important and amazing because this seems you can create applications that do a cohabitation between ng modules and standalone components. So the fact of having made the ng modules optional have huge impact on the Angular ecosystem, and the first one is on the module injector. Because now there is no modules anymore, it does not make sense anymore to speak about module injector. So now we must speak about environment injector. And of course, the introduction of standalone components. Now the bootstrapping is simpler and you have crazy new possibilities in routing. So always thanks to standalone components, now your application can bootstrap to a standalone components. And the application can bootstrap to a standalone components thanks to the new function bootstrap application. This function takes as a first argument the standalone components to which the application must bootstrap, okay? And take as a second argument a configuration object currently that have one property called providers. And this property is very important because this property lets us to register provider for the whole application. Okay, this property lets us to avoid the duplication of providers token. But a question must be solved. How can we register provider that are exposed by ng modules, like the famous HTTP client module or the famous routing modules? This is possible thanks to the import providers from helper function. This function takes as the only arguments ng modules that exposed providers. And this function takes care of registering your provider for the whole application. In the future, Angular will announce new helper function to avoid using this helper function. So an example can be if you want to perform the registering of the HTTP client provider of exposed by the HTTP client module, a helper function could be maybe with HTTP clients or provide HTTP client, okay? But this is just an ID. This function does not exist currently. So as I said, the fact of having introduced standalone components have several impacts on the routing, and that's why routing now have so much new possibilities, and all these possibilities are very crazy. So if you want to use standalone components, it's therefore normal to ask yourself some question, like, can we navigate to standalone components, or can we lazy load a standalone components? Better yet, is it possible to lazy load a root file that exposes a sub-routing configuration? The answer of all these questions are yes. So you have a lot of new possibilities, and the first one is yes, you can lazy load a standalone components, you can lazy load a route file. As you could do before, you can lazy load a module, and you can navigate to a component or a standalone component. So obviously, what was possible before is still possible now without any impacts. So this seems that we can do a cohabitation very easier between Angular standalone components and Angular ng modules. So to lazy load a standalone components is very easy, because now in a route configuration you have a new property called load components, and like its twin sister load children, load component take as a value a function, and this function must import your standalone components. So in other words, this function must import a type of standalone components, or a promise of a type of standalone components, or an observable of a type of standalone components. Okay, so now you have a route configuration, but the question is, how can we register your route configuration? And this is possible thanks to the helper function called provide route. This function takes your routing configuration in arguments, but what is very important is this function takes care of registering the provider exposed by the router module in the whole Angular application. So in your component, you can inject easily the activated route token or the router token. Sometimes we must create subrouting configuration called child routing, okay? And if you don't want to use ng modules, you must create a route file. And this route file must expose a subrouting configuration into which each route navigates to a standalone component. So all are standalone components if you want to use this feature. And to lazy load your route file, very easy. Use the load children property as you could do it before. The only change is you must import your route file. So if you want to lazy load a modules, you must import your modules file. But if you want to lazy load a route file, you must import your route file, okay? So another impact on the routing is the environment injector. So as I said, it does make no sense anymore now to speak about module injector. So the question is, how can we inject a specific provider for a specific feature module? There is no feature module anymore, so how can we do that? So this is very easy, because now in the routing configuration you have a new property called provider, and this property take as a value an array of provider. So in this piece of code, I just register a user service in the user environment injector. Okay, and with that, you can inject now on the login component or on the details component your user services. This will work. So this is very fantastic. And what is the best inside this feature is these components no need to be a standalone components. Okay, they can be classic components. The last feature in the routing is the new guard called CanMatch guard. This guard is very amazing, very powerful, and very magical, because this guard can first let us to make a choice between two components to display. So in this piece of code for the same path, to-dos, I would like to display to-dos page v2 components in my application is in version 2, or display the to-dos page components if my application is in version 1. And that's the perfect use case for the CanMatch guard, because this is the reason why we create the CanMatch guard. So if the to-do v2 guard return true, the to-do page v2 components will be loaded instead the to-do page components, and the to-do page v2 components will be displayed. But if the to-do v2 guard return false, the to-do page components will be loaded instead the to-do page v2 components, and the to-do page component will be displayed. CanMatch guard lets us another things and let us to avoid the combination of the can activated guard and the can load guard. So let's take a basic application as an example. So you have created an application with two features. First feature is the sign-in feature, and the second feature is your dashboard. Okay, so you want to prevent the navigation to the sign-in feature if your user is already logged. So now your user launch your application for the first time. So what happened at this moment? Your user is not logged, so he goes to the sign-in feature. On the sign-in feature. Yeah, so he logged, he entered its credential, and go to the dashboard. And now, imagine, he click on the back arrow of the browser. What will happen? Your user will go to the sign-in feature. But how is it possible? Because you have created a can load guard. This is possible because your sign-in feature was lazy loaded. So the first time, your module will be imported in the browser. Okay? So when you go back on this feature, you don't enter in the can load guard. And that's why a trick was to create a can activated guard on the subrouting navigation. So the magical guard CanMatch avoid to do that now, because CanMatch guard now return an observable of URL tree, so you can use it for this stuff. So in addition of this amazing feature, Angular introduced a new development pattern called the composition. And as I said, this pattern is already available in Vue 3 ecosystem thanks to the composition API. But in Angular, this pattern will be available thanks to the injection. So just a few words about the composition. Composition is a way to create high reusable code. So before Angular 14, and now Angular core team believe a lot in injection, and it's true because a lot of things is around the injection concept. So before Angular 14, Angular gives us a function called inject, and this function take as an argument a token. This function lets us to avoid writing constructor in provider, and this function works only in providers before Angular 14 because before this version, the inject function can be called only in an injection context. Okay, so if you use this function outside an injection context, Angular throw an error and said, hey, you must call inject function in an injection context. So instead of using this function, use a constructor. But now, in Angular 14, this function can be used outside an injection context. So you can use this function in a component. And this is great because it unblocks two things. The first one is the composition pattern. Composition is unlocked because now we can use this function, inject function, in outside injection context, so you can create helper file if you want. And the second thing is guard can become a function, and this is cool. Why? Before this version, we create guard with class annotation class because we need injection in our guards. But now, thanks to the inject function that works outside an injection function, you can just create a function and register this function as you can do it before with class. So this is very awesome because it lets now to create guards with less boilerplate. Sorry. So now let's go to few examples. So imagine I want to retrieve the parameter of a URL. In Angular, the code to retrieve the parameter of a URL is always the same. The only difference is the name of the parameter. So now, in terms of architecture, it's a best practice to create a shared folder and inside it to create a composable folder. And inside this composable folder, create a file composable on a specific entity, like the routing. Okay, so in this piece of code, I create simply a getParams method, and that takes the first argument, a name of a parameter, and I inject my token activated root. Okay, this is this provider that helps us to retrieve easily the parameter of a root, and I return the observable. Okay, and now how can I use this helper function? Simply in my components, at the initialization of the components, I create a ID user variable that is an observable, and I initialize it with my helper function. So this is very cool because now it's easy to respect the strict property of the TypeScript configuration. Let's deep dive to another example. So I want to prevent the navigation on my login components if my user is already logged. So for that, I create a function called already logged. And in this function, I inject my user service to retrieve my user if he's already logged. And if it's the case, I inject my router to navigate to the home page. And if my user is not logged, I authorize the navigation to the login components. So I create a function. The question is, how can I register this guard as you could do it before? Okay, just add the canActivate property and give the function. So this is very cool, right? Another question, in all my example, I use the inject function, okay, at the initialization of the components. But the question is it possible to use this function during the runtime? Okay, so imagine a user, he click on the button, and at the moment when he clicks on the button, you want to inject a provider. Is it possible? So, yeah, the answer is yes. Yes, thanks to the new provider called environment injector. Okay, so this environment injector gives us a new function called run in context, and this function take as the first argument a callback function. And in this callback function, you can do all what you want. You can inject all the provider you want. You can do all the business logic you want, everything you want. Just keep in mind that the inject function works synchronously. So the inject function will not work if you use it in an asynchronous callback or behind an await point. This is the only restriction. So now let's go on forms. It was a big feature requested by the community, and the community want that all the Angular forms was typed. And now this is the case. So typed forms let us to avoid stupid type mistakes. Okay? So the main goals of that is improve the robustness of our code. And if we improve the robustness of the code, you will improve the developer experience. Okay? Because now the developer can catch error easier and earlier. Sorry. It's not necessary to wait the build to catch an error. But the fact of having introduced types in forms have impacts on the existing API like form group. Okay, so just imagine you want to add or remove a control dynamically of your form group. It will be very complicated to type this kind of form, and that's why News API is available. So why the developer experience is improved? Because now all methods on form are typed, so no magical string. You have a better auto-completion in your TypeScript file, so this is very cool. And of course, Angular language services has better auto-completion in templates. Okay, so now it's very easy to create forms and you can do it very quickly because all is auto-completed. So transformation is very simple because now all the form control, form group, or form array take generic types. Okay, so in this piece of code you can see a form control that is typed to string or null, and this is a default behavior. Okay, this is a default behavior because when you reset a control, automatically Angular sets the value of this control to null. So if you want to avoid this behavior, you must set the non-nullable property to true in the configuration object of your control. Okay? Few words about form array. Now form array are strictly typed, so all the control in the form array must have the same type. It's not the case. Angular will throw you an error. So sometimes it's very interesting, it's very useful to have some flexibility in our code, and more specifically in forms. Okay? So sometimes you want to add or remove control dynamically, and that's why form record class is available now. So form record class and form group class are exactly the same, at the difference that the form record class must have all the control of the form record class must have the same types. Okay, so if it's not the case, Angular will throw an error. So it can be very useful when you use your form group as a map to which you add or remove control dynamically. So at this moment, it's very complicated to type, and that's where form record class here. So it can be handy if you want to display a list of checkbox. Just imagine you have a user and the user want to add or remove language they understand or don't understand dynamically. So form class is perfect for this use case. So a lot of feature, but when you say that, you can say, oh, the migration maybe will be very complicated, but not at all. It's not the case because all is done by the CLI. Okay, so when you migrate your project in the version 14, the CLI will migrate automatically form control, form group, form array, respectively to untype form control, untype form group, and untype form array. So untyped form array, etc., is just an alias for form array of type any. So you have no excuse now to don't migrate your application, okay? Because it's very easy, because all is done by the CLI. So this is very amazing. So now let's go to quick types and future of Angular. Revolution is very near, you can see. So quick types first. So if you want to migrate your application, first update component to standalone components thanks to the standalone property on the metadata of the component annotation. Don't forget to set this property to true. Then remove your shared module and import what component needs thanks to the imports property. Update your routing configuration, so you can do that step by step because you can do a computation between ng modules and standalone components. So migrate your routing step by step. Don't forget to change the bootstrapping of your application. So now, thanks to the Bootstrap application, you can bootstrap on a standalone components. And bonus, if you have some time, things to migrate your ground and refactor all your application to use amazing feature like inject function, etc., etc. So for library authors, who is a library authors here? Okay, so to migrate a library is very easy. So update component to standalone components and update secondary entry point module. Remove the declaration of your components and import the standalone components, and don't forget to export it. If you do that, you will have no breaking change. So this is cool. So now let's go to the potential future of Angular. So zoneless, okay? Angular won't make Angular framework zoneless. You can have more granularity in reactivity because currently you just can change the detection strategy, so on push or by default. So now you will have more granularity in reactivity, and maybe they will give us an alternative to Eric.js. Okay, so in this piece of code, it's just a POC. Don't use it in production, please. Just a POC. I integrate signals. So I create a count variable. I initiate it thanks to the use signals method, which take as the first argument the initialization of the variable. I create a double variable that is use computed. Okay, so when the count change, double change. And in my ng on init lifecycle, I use the effect function, and this function take as a first argument a callback. And in this callback, you can do all the business you want. But keep in mind, you can inject the provider here, okay, because I don't use the run in context function. So this is just a POC. And a second feature is maybe the fact of using Vite module bundler. So Vite module bundler is a new JavaScript bundle with no code configuration and is based on ES modules. A very, very fast, it's more faster than Webpack. Okay, you have better, So you have already a POC for the integration of Vite. It's called analog.js. You can already try it, but don't use it in production. Okay, it's just an ID, it's just a POC, and if you try it, give to the authors feedback. It will be awesome. So thanks a lot for listening. Sorry for my bad accent. You can follow me on Twitter at Nikos54 or in LinkedIn to Nicolas Frizzarin. And yes, take care of you and enjoy the rest of the Vox Day. Thank you. If you have any question, don't hesitate. You can come or ask.